Welcome to the Institute of Advanced Studies. For those who are new to the space, it's really wonderful to see you. I'm Marcia Mescom, and I'm the director of the Institute. And we are very, very excited to be welcoming Alessandro Rubino today. And I want to say a few things to those who have joined us online. So if you have joined us online, what you will find is that you have two buttons at the bottom of your screen. You have a Q&A and a chat button. We will monitor both the Q&A and the chat. So if you want to feed in comments and questions to this discussion and this seminar this afternoon, you are very, very welcome to do so and be part of the proceedings. We will record the talk itself, but we will not be recording the follow-up to conversations. We don't hold people's data. We don't keep the chat or anything like that. But you will be able to tune back in to the talk again through our video library, our YouTube channel on the IAS, and we'll let people know usually within a week of these. They're up and live and running. So. Without any further hesitation, we're very, really thrilled to welcome Professor Alessandro Rubino, who is coming to us from the University of Bari Aldo Alessandro is a specialist in energy economics and a thought leader in renewable energy sector with a wealth of experience in industry as well as academia. He is hosted by our wonderful colleague in the business school, Anna Rita Donato, and it's to Anna that I'm going to turn over at this moment to do a more formal introduction and talk about the nature of what this seminar will be today.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcia. So first of all, I would like to thank you very much to the Institute of Advanced Studies for giving me this great opportunity for networking and having international scholars over Loughborough. It's a great chance for us to continue our collaboration and to develop it further. The time is the turn of Alessandro Rubino. Alessandro is a scholar which main expertise relies in the energy market at the European level mainly. And it expanded towards like the academic, but also the industry, which means also the ability to disentangle topics that are also related to regulator and regulation as well. So today, the project that Alessandro will present is related to some procurement dimensions, which are still like an extension of the energy market. So Alessandro, I guess the floor is all yours right now.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Should I be standing or?
If you can stay seated.
Okay.
For the keyboard.
Okay. So thanks for the nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here back in Loughborough. I think I visited Loughborough many years ago for other reason. I think it was a volleyball tournament at that time. When I was working for Ofgem, and I'm grateful for the invitation and for being able to join you as a visiting fellow of the Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm going to talk today about a study that I'm running with a colleague of mine, Giuseppe Di Lido from Bari University, and it's about the procurement of public and private partnerships, so how they work around the world, in particular in low income countries. How can I? Okay. So our research question is mainly about how the institutional source of uncertainty, in particular institutional quality, determine the success or not of public-private partnership in developing economies. And this study comes from some direct experience we got in working in the Mediterranean region on energy projects. So that's the connection with my energy expertise. So basically, we ended up in several circumstances in countries like Lebanon, Tunisia, where a lot of public-private partnership for services or investment didn't get any attention from the private sector. And it was a question from the regulatory authority at those times asking what was wrong with those codes. And also we have developing a twin paper that is progressing in parallel with that about the role of patent and the research and innovation in those countries. So basically, we understood that you cannot really copy paste any public-private partnership agreement that work in other countries, in any other places, and pretend and make sure that they work in any case, because they really depend on the institutional factors that affect each market and each country, and also for what comes in, and this is much more related with the research and innovation paper we are developing. Also, not all the industry can have the sort of satellite services that are required in order to run, for instance, a new renewable project in any country. So perhaps that's our aspect that can be need to be developed together. So there is a factor of co-evolution of the local environment and the business you're trying to integrate in a certain community. The motivation for these studies comes from these questions that we receive from mainly from energy regulator, but also from ministries and institutions that were developing project in the energy field, but also that extend outside the energy world, and has to do with the infrastructure investment in general. What we've seen is that the public sector itself, in particular after the COVID disruptions, cannot really cope with the large-scale investment that are needed in many infrastructure we have, and in particular in low-income economies, then that's harder. It's even higher because public bodies rarely can mobilize the kind of finance that are needed to provide those services. And also the PPP, public-private partnership project adoption depends not only on the finance that the companies are able to, the countries are able to mobilize, but also the governance capacity that is existing in those countries. So we try to bridge these questions and try to see with our transaction cost theory lenses how the institutional quality might matter for attracting PPP, and whether there is a degree of sort of there is a level of sort of overlap of governance type with different type of investment, and therefore we will look at the different type of governance we have in public-private partnership to see where they fit best with the type of investment we're looking for. So I don't know whether you are familiar with public-private partnership, but I'll give you just an overview of what PPPs are about. When we talk about public-private partnership, we refer to agreement between public and private sectors, and this agreement dictates the sort of services that or tasks that the public sector sort of gives out to private parties, and there are different forms of PPPs, and they can go from very limited sort of service provision kind of agreement, and others that are more and more strictly connected with running the business altogether. And we will see that the different range of PPP agreement can vary in terms of the involvement and the risk taken by the private party. So the arrangement between the public and the private sector obviously are set out in a contract, and the involvement of the private parties in this sector or in the services they are providing really depends on the degree in which the private sector is involved. It can be very little. So basically, the involvement of the private sectors is limited to providing some basic services, or can be a full provision of services, including investment in the facilities. And in between, we have a spectrum of participation of the private sectors that goes increasing as we move to the right of this graph. Our idea was to see, let's try to put together the different typology of PPP participation, and basically from the low to the high level of private sector participation, to the kind of services that PPP are offering in most of the low-income countries that we have studied. You will see we've been using a World Bank database to study basically all the developing economies that the database cover. So a bit more in terms of the PPP schemes and in terms of the governance we can have. As I mentioned, we are moving from a low participation of the private sector on the left side of the graph I showed you before, to very high participation of the private sector. And basically this translates in different form of governance and contract. The first type of governance participation is the management and lease contract that can have two different forms, with a little bit of variation between the two forms. One is the management contract and the other is the lease contract. And obviously the difference is that there is a lease in the second type of arrangement, whereas there is simply a contract in the first one. And basically there is a contract that dictates the amount of the fee that the parties need to exchange. That can be a fixed sum or an incentive-based fee for achieving specific result. The same arrangement can happen also in the lease contract, and this is the lowest level of engagement of the private party you can have in PPPs. Then we have brownfield type of arrangements, and moving up in the ladder of the private participation in public-private parties arrangement. And basically the brownfield type of contract, we have that the private entity takes over and operates an existing asset, and on this existing asset it is allowed or normally required to make improvement or rehabilitation to it or expand it. So basically there is some sort of physical intervention on the facilities. It's not just a contractual arrangement that make use of the existing facilities. There is a higher degree of management of the infrastructure, and there are three types under this larger category that is within the brownfields type of governance. Three types of governance that goes from rehabilitate, operate, and transfer, and then rehabilitate, lease, or rent and transfer, and then build, rehabilitate, operate, and transfer. Again, even in this type of different degrees of governance, what changes the level of involvement that the private parties have. And in one case, so when we start with the rehabilitate, operate, and transfer kind of arrangement, the private sponsor uses the existing facility, providing some improvement, and then maintains the facility and the risk connected with the activities that are attached to this kind of function for the contractual period. And then if we move to number 5, then in that situation, we have that the private party makes investment, builds or adds to the existing facilities, and then operates and maintains the facility, keeping obviously all the risk of the contractual period in its hand. And then we have the greenfield kind of arrangement. That means that the private entity or a joint venture between public and private entity, then run some investment specific for the project, and the private entity takes also some of the financial and operational risk in obviously making this specific investment, and recovers the investment typically under the efficient life duration of the project via fees or other revenues that can extract from the running these services. Even here we have a even larger differentiation of types of governance we can have. So we move from a lower degree of participation to a higher degree of participation, and which means that the private party can build and operate and transfer the facility, or build and lease and transfer the facility, and then can also own the facility and then operate it, and then work as a merchant. And then finally, there is some sort of rental agreement that can basically makes the private sponsor using a new facility at its own risk, and then owns and operates the facility at its own risk. So what changes in this, as long as we've been moving from the governance type 1 to governance type 3, and we'll see also for governance type 4, is the amount of risk that is placed on the private parties that goes increasing as long as we move in the more sort of high intensity role for private parties. And then we have the fourth type, which is the full or partial divestiture. Basically, when there is a private entity that buys an equity stake in a state-owned enterprise, and that normally happens in a situation of sales, public offering, privatization program, and basically the private operator takes full control and full responsibility of the operation, maintenance, and investment that refers to the infrastructure and the services connected to the infrastructure. So obviously this is the sort of greater level of involvement of the private parties. Here, the private parties take complete control of the operation of the facility. And then we have a little differentiation here between partial divestiture and full divestiture. Partial divestiture obviously is when the government keeps some of the shares of the facility, whereas the full divestiture is when the government transfer 100% of the equity of the former state-owned company to private entities. And we've been seeing a lot of this, well, in the UK, in Italy, in the energy sector, for instance, but in many other sectors. So this is just an overview of the PPP, and so to provide you sort of an understanding of where we're coming from. So we have seen that the public-private, with the term public-private partnership, we might indicate very different animals. We can have a situation in which the private sector has 100% responsibility around the infrastructure and the services on one end, another involvement in which the private sector only marginally operate an existing facilities for a very limited time. The contractual arrangement can go from 1 rarely to 3, 5, 20 years, depends. And in between we have increasing degrees of participation of the private parties. So what we wanted to see is looking at the transaction cost theory that is very popular among economists. I know that not all of you are economists around this talk today, but it's the transaction cost is about the cost of carrying out a transaction in the framework of an exchange in an open market. That's how originally that theory was studied by Coase. We're talking about 1937. Obviously, there's been a lot of this literature has been evolving for the past 80, 90 years now. Lately, in the 2020, there's been this paper, which is quite popular in the sector, about the connection between the institutional transaction cost. So how much it costs for institution in terms of learning how to do stuff, being able to set up contracts, setting up the right framework in order for private parties to run services in their public services, and the type and governance of PPPs. So we're trying to sort of work in that arena, looking at how the different type of PPPs can be work and overlap with different type of institutional capacity that different countries and different organizations might have. And the transaction cost categories that we've been looking at are the information cost. I mentioned before the example of some calls for private services call that some countries put out many years ago, and then when they ended up their period for the call, they found out that there was nobody applying for it. That was partially because of those information costs. It's not easy for private parties that, even when they are very well equipped, I'm talking about multinational company that operates in different countries and different markets, to be able to find out those opportunities, but also find out the sort of define details of those opportunities. Basically, what are the real requirements that contract requires. And of course, in case of uncertainty or little clarity about the contract obligation, companies normally are risk adverse, tend to be out of market, that they cannot really control or understand well. And then there is the bargaining cost, the cost that is required to come up to an acceptable agreement with the other party to the transaction. And then the policing and enforcement cost, which is the cost that you have to incur when you are giving out some of the services that you normally provide as a public body to a private party, and then trying to keep an eye open on how these parties are performing, if they are complying with the obligation, if they're running the service in an efficient way. I've been doing a lot of this policing and enforcement costs in Ofgem. It takes an army of economists and consultants to do it, because obviously there is a complexity of the sector, which is obviously one factor, but also there is the fact that the true cost of running, for instance, transmission services are only known by are very well known by the transmission system operator, and then you need to find out ways of extracting information when you deal with these entities. So in all of that, we thought that the quality of institution matters a lot. So if you have a minister, a country that is endowed with good institutions that are able to sort of keep an eye on the information costs, bargaining costs, policy and enforcement costs, then obviously you might be able to extract much more rent from the private parties that operate the services for you, and therefore being more efficient in providing the services for your people. Otherwise, when your quality of institution is low, then it will be more difficult to interact with the private parties that are normally very good in sort of juggle the information, in hiding legally, obviously, costs and, you know, providing just the information they want you to, and this sort of things depend a lot on the quality of the institution. And there's been a bit of literature studying the level of private involvement when we have uncertainty in terms of the quality of institutions that are engaged in the provision of those public-private service partnership. Most of this literature refers to sort of mature economies, but we think this sort of analysis is much more relevant for developing economies, because for the reason I mentioned before. First of all, they have to use PPPs more than mature economies because they do not have the finance to make, at least in the initial stage, the investment required to run efficiently very capital-intensive business such as telecommunication, energy, road and transport facilities, etc. And the other thing is that the mature economies moved to the PPP kind of arrangement after there was the very strong state-owned involvement in providing these services. So basically, internally, although this memory is disappearing in the sort of the governance institution that take care of this PPP, there is a understanding of how to run those business. Energy sector, basically in all countries, in Europe has been state-owned for many years, then has been privatized very recently. So the wealth of understanding of the business we have on those kind of services is much greater in mature economies, and therefore also governing the sort of arrangement and the contractual and services arrangement might be easier. For hopefully those sort of motivation and framework analysis make sense to you, and therefore we ask ourselves if we would like to see how the type of contractual arrangement change depending on the institutional quality of the countries involved in these PPPs. Let's try to have a look empirically at what the data tell us. And we've been using this database now for a while, and we've been looking at the PPI database of the World Bank, which is collecting basically all, or they claim they collect all the PPPs contracts in developing economies, under 37 low and middle income developing countries. And we know basically almost everything about those contracts. So we know the type of contractual arrangement they are in, the amount, so the budget of the investment of the private party, and the remaining amount of the investment that remains on the public parties, and the duration of the contract, if there is a contract, there are the device. All the data we need are there, and that's heaven actually. And we know also the timeline in which this project has been developed for many years. How many years the contract is running. And then we try to combine this information with control variables that depends on the gross domestic income, inflation rate, tax rate, the contribution rate, the population, and all the control variables that normally I use when you study the level of performance and engagement of countries and when you're looking at the matters such as investment and service provision. And then we combine those information with the worldwide governance indicators, the WGI database that is from the World Bank, that provides aggregate and individual governance indicators for over 200 countries and territories, and they got this measurement spanning from 1996 to 2021. So what, and I don't know if you're familiar with this database, but these databases are quite interesting for us because they measure a number of dimensions that are very important for trying to have an indication of the level of quality institution. So what they measure is 6 main dimensions, which are voice and accountability, political stability and absence of violence, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. We think that while there is some sort of overlap of this dimension in some situation, but they measure different type of dimension, which are useful to understand how different countries compare between them and how the quality of institution attracts or not different type of PPPs.
Sorry, have you considered maybe something on the slide? I think it's the Fraser Institute that has specific data on the openness of credit markets, the transparency, because that might actually matter quite a lot in terms of.
We haven't used that database, but that's.
It could be quite useful, and also on informal institutions, that is formal institutions, so the level of trust in a country.
That's actually we're running another. Well, then we're not putting all together, but we are running another analysis on the informal institution because we feel that they might play a big role. We don't know how to really combine all together because there is a lot of information, and sometimes there is also a lot of correlation between these different dimensions.
Maybe principal component, if there's high correlation and they work together, you see, it will be probably very useful. Use the functionality time.
So could you clarify what the dependent variable is? So on the previous slide, you had something about the second bullet.
Yeah, it's the PPPs. So we use 2 different types of dependent variables. So the number of contractual arrangement and the value.
So you observe every contract in every year for a country?
Yes.
And then you somehow take information.
So we count sometimes. It's a count when we use the number of projects, but also we have used the amount, the value of the project, the volume. Yes. The problem with the volume, I'll show you in a bit, is that in particular in low-income economies, you might have a huge project. I don't know, building an airport. That it's a big blip in the data, so you have like a large amount of PPPs, and then 0 for many years, or perhaps even small project, but they will be dwarfed by the amount of this large project. So we have to use the 2 of them. And we try, you will see, we give a bit of details there. We try to span the investment across the duration of the contract, because obviously you're doing an investment that has a very specific contractual date in which it happens. But obviously building and running for instance, an airport, it cannot be just localized in 1 year.
So what is this supposed to measure? Somehow the success in attracting investment?
Yeah, that's the idea. So we try to measure the success. So if there is, first of all, the success in attracting investment, and what we try to see is not only how much investment you are able to attract and how many, but what kind of investment.
So what about if these things go wrong? Like, so this famous example is these these boats, these tuna boats. So they attracted all this money to buy all these boats, but it turns out it was all corrupt and they never got to use these boats.
Well, normally we refer to the data set that says the contractual closure of any agreement. So if then the service is poor quality or then is provided and there is corruption situation, we don't have any track of that. We see whether the investment arrived, if they run under specific contractual arrangement, and what is the duration of that contract. Then the quality sort of the service provided, then that's not measured here.
So I guess there's lots, you might know this better, there's probably a lot of power plants that are built, but
Yeah.
they never operated.
Well, but there are some situations like that, but that's normally, so if we're talking about energy, normally when they open up some call for provision of services or building infrastructure, normally they desperately need that. And normally, unless there is some disruption in the supply chain, for instance, for providing natural gas or other thing, the plant is built because they need it and therefore normally runs. Obviously, sort of mismanagement can happen and there are situations. What is in the news many times is that you build, I don't know, a wind park in a place, and then only after building it, you see that the performance of the wind park is very low. So, for instance, you build it in the wrong place. But that's, in general, about this type of investment, the private, but in particular public parties are gaining a lot of experience that you need to do a lot of preparatory work to see whether the project has the numbers to run afterward. There has been quite important mistakes of this type. For instance, even in Italy, we've been building wind parks in places where there was little wind. Actually, we've been doing a paper about that in a specific region in Italy, Tuscany, where we found out that there are windmills that in some locations they barely run, I don't know, 1 or 2 hours per day. So very inefficient. The reason being that because the regulation was very poor at very beginning of the energy transition process, there was an incentive to make the investment, but not to generate electricity out of that investment. So basically, you were not measuring the power that you get out of the capacity installed, but just the capacity installed. So the bigger the plant, the bigger the money you receive from the state. And obviously, the rush was to find out a place that a land area that is an authorization, and you didn't really care a lot about if the wind was blowing or the sun was shining there. And we got some of these poor experience in the past. Obviously, we're talking about the very pioneering times of the renewable investment. That's come to an end at some point. Obviously, you got paid for part of your remuneration depends on the amount of electricity you actually put into the system and not just the capacity you install, because you can have capacity that is installed and never runs. So there has been mistake of this type. I guess at the beginning of the utilization of these incentive mechanisms for renewable, there was very little experience, very little. So a lot of mistakes were we in Italy made a lot of mistake in the regulation. I can mention also other mistakes where we had here in the UK, Ofgem as well. The regulation at that early stage was not easy. There was well, not very good understanding of the industry altogether. So in principle, we might have in this database plans that have been installed. They got some sort of contractual arrangement with the state, but they never generate. We do not have the data to check that information.
You know that they are, you know how many actually failed to achieve their aims. This could be sort of introduced or your variable, I've been talking about this. Maybe the variable as opposed to corruption. If you don't.
Yeah, I mean, in this specific analysis, we're not running this data for Italy, Europe in general. Yeah.
Because this kind of experience is going to feed into what people perceive as a
yeah, definitely. It would be interesting to see. Then the other thing is define success rate of an investment of this kind, because obviously there is the obvious example. You place your windmill in a place where no wind is there, and then obviously there is no success. But I mean, there is a degree of sort of measurement of this degree of success, and we're trying to do it for Tuscany, and it's very, very complicated because the idea is even a marginal contribution to the energy system in a region can be useful. In particular, if you have to reach some sort of target in complying with renewables obligation, etc. So, and sometimes the ideal place where you would like to have your investment done are not available. In Tuscany, there is a lot of limitation for historical agriculture use and stuff like that. So the best location is exactly where the Chianti vineyard are. So obviously nobody's gonna give you Chianti vineyard land to put windmills, etc. So obviously you need to put this kind of investment where it's efficient, but also where it's possible. And the combination of actually we're working on that in this very moment. And if you look at that, there is a lot of components that you need to take into consideration. So the speed of the authorization process, the quality of the wind and the sun exposure you have, the vicinity, the connection with the transmission system or distribution system lines. So even if you have a fantastic location, which is 100 kilometers away from the transmission system, then you're not going to pick that location. So if you dig into the reason for success or the lack of success of some of these investments, obviously the variables become a lot. We're trying to do that, but that's a very specific local study that you need to run. We're trying to expand it to an Italian level, in particular for the location of renewable investment. There are some interesting results coming up. We can talk about that if you like. But as I mentioned, this is a different study.
I'd like to understand your dependent variable and then what it means about the research question a little bit, because so first of all, you say there it's measures the private presence in PPPs. So first of all, that makes me think that private presence sounds like a stock of investment in PPPs, which would take into account. I've got an idea in my mind that you're slowly contracting out something that's municipally run and the water company in Germany or something. And so what you would get is over time, there would be a buildup in the stock of investment or capital. But I thought you said that it almost sounds like you described it before, that there was, at times there was nothing. There's a big investment in an airport and there isn't. So is it stock data, in other words, the amount of investment that has in PPPs, or is it flow data in the sense that, well, an airport investment happens and then it's zero afterwards? So are you measuring, I guess, the stock of PPP or the flow of PPP?
We measure the flow.
Measure the flow.
For the reason being that, so there's one caveat about that I'll mention in a second, but the idea is that the stock you might have So the idea is that the quality of the institution, although slowly, change over time. And so a country that was completely unable for some reason to attract investment in a specific moment, then will become more attractive and then less attractive, in particular in low-income economies. That happens a lot. Think about, I don't know, Libya. That was a place where there was a lot of projects with private parties coming from Italy, for example, and then drop completely at one place in one moment and then come back, etc. And so we would like to see whether this impact is sort of straightforward. The other thing is then that you have countries that are for the size of the country itself, we control for that, but for the size of the country itself are able to attract a lot more investment than other tiny markets. Think about Jordan, Jordania, and I don't know, Turkey or China. Obviously, the amount of investment that China is receiving over time is gigantic. And they refer to situations that are in the past perhaps very different from what we have over time. So we look at the flow of investment with one caveat. I mentioned that if we have a duration of contractual arrangement, we span the amount that we have for the specific contractual year for the duration of the contractual arrangement. So if in 2010 we have a contractual arrangement for a PPP agreement that lasts 10 years, that amounts for 10 million euros, then we split 10 million euros in each of this year. Because the idea is that the sort of the private agreement lasts for an amount of time that it's sort of trying to, and that's the duration. So we pro rata take the amount of investment that is referred to for each year. So I was talking about the dimension that measures of the quality of the institution. So voice and accountability, the participation of the citizen to the ability of the citizen to determine their government, freedom of expression, etc. Then the political stability, look at the likelihood for political instability or violence in a specific country. And then the government effectiveness is the quality of the public is related, captures the quality of public services, quality of the civil services, the degree of its independence, etc. Regulatory quality captures the perception and the ability of the government to formulate independent regulatory arrangement, and then rule of law measure the perception on the confidence on our society to apply specific regulation and rules, property rights, the functioning of the police, etc. And then the control of corruption measure the perception and the extent to which public power is exercised for private gains, including petty and ground forms of corruption, and also the ability to capture the elite of a specific country, the ability of the private sector to capture the elite. So I think it's very little, but you can see. So the descriptive statistics of these data, the data set that we have put together, and yeah. Yeah, I wanted to just show you that governance indicators normally are measured in a range between -2.5 and 2.5, and then we have sort of rerun this number in our base 0, 100. So that's basically these last rows over here. And it's a transformation of the original measurement of this institutional quality dimension. And then this is the number of the project that we have measured, over 2,000 projects. And then we have checked the number of the different projects in different sectors. And basically, these are the data that we've been using in the database, in the analysis. That's the econometric specification of our analysis. So what we measure is the dependent variables, and you will see we run two types of dependent variables on the number and on the amount of PPP investment, and we look at the degree of participation of the private sector in this public-private arrangement. For each country, I at the time T. From the governance of financing point of view, so the level of involvement of the private parties, we have differentiated the different type of PPPs in a range that goes from 0 to 12, and that reflects the characterization I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation when I described the different type of PPP project we can have.
So it's not it's not a measure of presence, it's a measure of over the diversity of potential PPP projects, how many of them are present.
Sorry?
There's 12 different types, so if it's 12, then in that year there were 12 different types of PPP projects.
There might be 12, there might be 0, depending on the situation.
It's not a measure of investment in the sense of 100 million.
No. It's the level of the private participation within each. So the share, it's the degree of commitment of the private sector within each of the projects. And the idea is that the more, so the diversity we trying to understand is how much the private sector needs or wants to get involved in the provision of these services, and if that has a direct connection with the quality of the institution in each countries. And we will provide some perhaps interesting research at some point. And then we measure, obviously, the governance indicator, and then we measure with the matrix C the set of the control variables, and then we measure the regional dimension of each country, because we divided the data set in East Asia, Europe and Central Asia, Latin American, Caribbean, Middle East and North Africa, North America and South Asian, Sub-Saharan Africa, in order to capture the specificity of this region. And then we got the normal random and error component. And then it's interesting, well, for us was interesting to see the degree of correlation between the board governance indicator. We have been using for each run a different WGI indicator because they are highly correlated. That's somehow expected. If a country is working very badly or very well, in terms of quality of law, control of corruption, etc., you expect they do tend to perform well also in the other dimension. And the data show that there is a good degree of correlation, and therefore when we put all these variables together in one regression, then they tend to cannibalize each other. So we have been running that separately for each one.
Okay, sorry, because you could actually then incur specification bias if you pick something out. It's never an optimal solution for high linearity. You could build an index.
Yeah.
The principal component analysis will address exactly that problem. So it will reduce eliminate the dimensionality of that into one measure only without losing the information.
Yeah, that's an option that we've been considering, but we never put in place, to be honest.
So
but
what's the economic meaning of that one principal component you put in the end? How do you interpret it?
Well, you have to interpret the results of the health of the obviously with higher methods or competitive content, but that's the way around it, or another index. I mean, it doesn't have to be PCA.
The problem we have, that's sort of an index of an index, that's the thing. Because also each of those indicators are like an average of a number of dimensions. But would be very happy to find out a way out of this issue, because that's a bit of a aspect that we've been discussing. And yes, we run this Tobit model because of the bounded nature of the dependent variable. So we use this panel Tobit random effect model because we got like a lot of zero in our database, because those countries do not attract PPPs every year, and this zero might can be interpreted as the absence of any demand for infrastructure project in that specific year. Obviously, having so many zeros puts it's not really easy to handle in the econometric specification, but with the Tobit model, we can account for the truncation of the database, and then we can sort of run an OLS or a GLS that the specification that we've been employed in our estimation. You would see it in a while. So what we do with this truncation is that we make the relationship between the investment variable and the independent variable more complex than the traditional regression model.
You're talking about inflation of zeros, and you might want to think about inflated models, because they would combine different types of zeros, especially when we have a lot of them. So because you could have a zero because there wouldn't be investment anyway, or in that case, there would be different type of zeros, saying if the conditions were different, the investment would take place. And especially when you have counts, I think you probably your variables behave like this bit, right?
Yeah.
The negative binomial would be a great model.
Yeah.
So these two types of models I would investigate, but that looks like a perfect.
Yeah, that's great suggestion. As I mentioned, this is a work in progress. We're looking for like alternative specification of the model. But one of the issues that we have this database with a lot of zeros and then a lot of spikes, and whereas the variability, for instance, of the work governance indicator is much less pronunciated. So you need to combine a database that it's very mixed in terms of the nature of the information we're putting together.
Slight clarification, but it might be a relevant point, is it's not an absence of investment, it's an absence of PPP investment.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, if I think about Scottish border versus England border, where you wouldn't get if the governance structure, I'm not saying Scotland is, But if the governance structure is such that public investment is actually a quite good way of doing things, you might get lots of public investment and no PPP.
Yeah. I guess there is some sort of combination of this different type of investment that or even in those countries are happening. And that's another evolution of the paper that we're planning to do. But in this specific analysis, our idea is to see. Of course, there have been. We think we have evidence that there have been different types of investment besides the PPP, even in the infrastructure domain. But the idea is to see. Considering the specificity of those countries that are constantly looking for donors and participation of private sector, we look at that specific type of investment also because in those countries these are largely the majority of investment. We're talking about like 90% sort of proportion of investment in infrastructure. So we're missing some information, definitely only look at PPPs, but I guess this is a good approximation of the type and the number of the investment happening in these kind of, I'll try to speed up a bit. Actually, how many minutes we have more?
7.
Okay. So I better get to the conclusion at some point. Okay. So we run a bit of a post estimation. Tests and but I prefer to go straight to the some of our results. So basically, what we measuring here is the impact of the type of governance on the. So here we're measuring. In terms of type of governance, PPPs agreement that we have from 0 to 12, and we see what is the impact of the different aspects that we just mentioned, looking at, as I mentioned, at GDP, population, inflation, and general government gross debts, and then we have the quality of institution indicators. So voice and accountability, political stability, effectiveness of the government, regulatory quality, etc. So we do have obviously a negative. Well, we do have some important impact of the GDP, of the population. That is some sort of a measure of the size of the market, and then a positive impact of the work governance indicator. So the expected results in terms of the impact of the quality of institution. I try to go a bit fast here. And then here, and then here we measure the impact of the governance structure in terms of ability to attract investment. And again, what we measure is the regressors are the usual one we have, and then the results are those that you can see with a lot of a strong impact of the GDP and the population as expected, and a bit of differentiation of the result that I'm going to discuss in the results and conclusion slide that I would like to go through before we run out of time. I put all the here. So happy to go back to some of the regression if we have a bit more time, but let me go through the conclusion first, and then in case we have time, we go back to the results. So basically, we have been trying to study what is the connection, the impact of the different type, the level of the quality of the institution in terms of PPP investment, looking at the type and the quantity of investment we get under public-private partnership arrangement, and the relationship between institutional quality and private party presence in the PPP governance has been the object of this analysis for developing economies. So what we've seen is that the institutional environment is very important in determining how much private parties is involved in PPPs, and these preliminary estimates have been sort of suggesting that there is a strong connection between quality of institution and ability to attract investment. Our results suggest that all the 6 dimensions of institutional quality do play a role in attracting private presence and in the PPP governance structure. So the different type of quality, the different level of institutional quality affects not only the amount of investment, but also the type of investment you have. The regulatory quality in terms of the point coefficient we obtain is the most important dimension in attracting private investment and also in managing infrastructure projects, which is quite expected because of the important role that the regulatory institutions have in running this business that normally rely on infrastructure that are regulated, so network, pipelines, trucks, and therefore the regulatory quality is quite expected that plays an important role in there. The possible extension we have to this analysis are somehow connected with some of the comments we received here, and we would like to see a bit more in depth what are the specific projects have to do and how they're run, where they're located, if they've been successful or not. And then we are doing a bit of separate analysis for each sector in particular. So ICT, energy, and transport are the obvious candidate to see more specific analysis because they do have some differentiation in terms of private involvement. And then we're looking also at measuring the dependent variable as a weighted averages, depending on the size of the project, instead of the simple average that we've been using in these instances. So I wanted to get to the conclusion because I know we're running out of time, but happy to go back to the regression, perhaps over coffee or later on.
Yes, thank you so much.